Free to be on camera. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Joy McKill. I'm the Senior Program Officer with Refugee Welcome Collective. I want to first welcome you to our Refugee Welcome Collective monthly webinars. In these sessions, we aim to bring you timely and interesting information. Our monthly webinars are social learning spaces and are meant to be a space for you as staff at the local and the national levels to share resources, best practices, challenges, and lessons learned in the field. So we hope that you enjoy today's session. If you want to go far, go together, building intentional community partnerships. Just a little bit about us. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, monthly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and that's to support the quality of community sponsorship programs across the United States. For housekeeping, as a reminder for everyone joining us today, everyone in today's webinar is going to be automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please submit it in the chat so we can assist you. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to drop it also in the chat, and our speaker is going to answer your questions, or you can also wait toward the end of the webinar for Q&A, but still drop your questions in the chat so we can have a record of them, and feel free to come off mute during the Q&A time to ask any question that you might have. Additionally, any resources and recording of today's webinar will be sent out to everyone. And that brings us to our presenter for today, Emily Griffith, who is the Community Sponsorship Specialist with Highest. Thank you so much, Emily, for being here. And I'm going to give it to you from here.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Like Joy was saying, I'm Emily Griffith. I'm the Community Sponsorship Specialist at Highest. So my role is working with our 30 local resettlement agencies across the U.S. to ensure that community sponsorship is happening, that we're doing strategic planning to ensure that we're reaching the public and help them get opportunities to volunteer. So that's just a little bit about me. Okay. So we're going to go through what we're going to talk about in this session is some of the boundary setting, some of the values that volunteers bring to our organizations, as well as how we can set boundaries, because we know that that's like a constant hot topic. Before we do that, I'm going to go down this list of different examples. If you could just click through, I think. Great. So I just want you all to think of if any of you have experienced any of these things happening to you. So a friend or an acquaintance has referred you to a job. You've had someone to turn to co-sign a loan or lease agreement. Someone has written you a recommendation letter. Someone has recommended you to a place to go for car repair, haircut, other service. A friend gifted you something you mentioned you needed or wanted. So probably some of you have experienced some, if not all of these things. And if you said yes to any of those things, and hit the mute, sorry about that. You might have experienced some of these things. And these are all examples of social capital. These are all things that our volunteers are kind of informally bringing to refugees currently. And I want you to think if you've had any of these things done for you, or you received help in this way from someone you know, if you felt that it made you less self-sufficient. Most of you would say no, this is part of life to be getting social capital, getting support. We like to frame it like this because sometimes we get sort of overprotective sometimes of volunteers not helping refugees in specific ways, but we should maybe start looking at some of these things as forms of social capital. These are very natural things for volunteers to want to help with. They're things that we've received assistance in, and many of the refugees who come here don't have the level of social capital that maybe we do if we've been living here for quite some time. You have networks of friends, family members, professional colleagues. These are some things that maybe refugees don't have access to, and that's why co-sponsorship support teams are really important, because they act as these networks that refugees can tap into to kind of also receive some of the social capital. So when we're thinking of self-sufficiency, that doesn't mean absence of help, right? I think that's important to frame the conversation of we're looking for support from volunteers. We don't want them to overstep, but we also want to be mindful that some of the ways in which they help are actually just parts of receiving social capital. So that's something we've been trying to reframe a little bit at highest, at least. I hope that makes sense to some of you, or most of you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And you can click through these as well. I think it's just animated. So these are just examples of what refugees have to say about volunteerism. This is another thing we like to think about before we start getting into how do we set boundaries, how do we manage volunteers. It's really important to think of the value. And these, at highest, we've done a lot of different focus group studies. We've done personal key informant interviews with refugees who receive support from co-sponsors specifically. And these are direct quotes coming from our sites in Pittsburgh and Ann Arbor. And just to read a few of them, they are wonderful people. They give themselves to make us feel happy and like at home. In spite of coming here with so many problems and traumatized, their help and their advice helps get us through. They make us feel like family. They helped us to understand the laws and how to get on with things here. I wouldn't have been able to endure here without their help. It's very important that every family has a volunteer to help them and stay with them. So you can read some of those on your own time, but those are just some of the key phrases that we pulled out of and one of many of studies we've done and just like information sharing we've been hearing from refugees. And that's why it is so important that even though it can be challenging to work with volunteers sometimes and co-sponsors, that we are still engaging them because we can definitely see that there's a huge benefit to the families. You can go to next slide. Okay. So now that we've kind of framed it in that context of, refugees should be engaging in social capital, normal for them to have access to social capital, and that there's a lot of value in volunteerism for them, specifically hearing from refugees themselves. They really value the community support that is provided through co-sponsorship and support teams and other forms of volunteerism. We can kind of get into how can we engage volunteers in a manner that is respectful to your time, as well as contributing to the refugees. And we're gonna learn some conversational tools, some active listening. We're gonna go through some scenarios where you might have already occurred or you've already seen in your own practice. They're going to be pretty common scenarios, but even if you haven't come across them or you don't think you will, the same tools of active listening will apply. So we'll be going through some real life scenarios too. So when we think about volunteers and the community members, what they really want to do is help, right? So when we're thinking about the mindset they're coming into, they really want to come in with their best heart. They have an open mind usually, but they also might have their own ways of thinking of how they'll be helping, and how you frame that is really important. They come with the energy and the excitement, and we're kind of here to put the guardrails on of how to direct that energy. Go to the next slide. And then from the view of the individuals and families we serve, it's obvious that, that they're personalized, the volunteers are personalized to the families that they're assigned to. Volunteers offer very direct services and can do them over and over again, like learning how to drive, helping someone learn how to drive, how to use their EPT card. And they can eventually become friends and a connection to the community, like we mentioned earlier. And truthfully, it goes with everyone's responsibility to welcome the stranger, right? We really need our community. They're not an optional asset. We really need them. It's a public-private partnership with everyone involved. And that's why, it's really important to keep engaging in this work. Okay. We can go to the next slide. That's basically the same thing. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to go into some of the key communication skills that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And the first one we're going to talk about is active listening. If you've heard of active listening before, it can be kind of hard to really know what that means if you don't kind of see it broken down. It might seem like you're just making eye contact. That might be one aspect of it, but there's a lot of other ways to be an active listener. And if you've practiced active listening, it can be really tiring sometimes. But it's a skill. It's a skill that takes time to develop. And it's something that is really needed with volunteers, right? Paying attention when they're speaking to you about an issue, whether it's during a meeting or they're catching you while you're in the office, asking them open-ended questions about their experience. Something that we see happens a lot sometimes is a volunteer might come with a concern, and we might tell them why it's not necessary to worry. That can feel really invalidating, even if it's true. Even in that moment, if there's not a need to panic or worry or have a reaction to what we think is a reaction to something, we might want to ask questions on their end of why they're concerned, right? I'm hearing that this is kind of stressful for you, not knowing the exact day, like the refugee family's coming. What are you thinking about in this process? Asking them to kind of break down their thought process to you so you can affirm whatever the issue or concern is. Same thing with asking probing questions, clarifying with them to make sure you're understanding what the concern is. And again, we're not asking that staff become therapists for volunteers, but there is a level of engagement and some sort of emotional attunement to the concerns of volunteers, especially if we're asking them to be helping in a big way, right? And you can kind of adjust how much you're providing active listening depending on what is the level of involvement. If they're just helping with transportation, the concerns are not going to get to the level where you need to provide this much active listening. But if they're a co-sponsor who's pretty heavily involved, they're getting prepared, they're working with their community members to organize for you and welcome a family, there might be a lot of different aspects going on. If this is their first time welcoming a newcomer, you might need to engage in this sort of skill set a bit more. So here's an example, right? We talked about what it kind of looks like. It's eye contact, it's probing questions, it's paraphrasing what they're hearing. So here's an example of active listening. I'm hearing, this is the paraphrasing portion. It was difficult for the client to sit with the uncertainty of when the employment authorization card may come. It must have been difficult for you to sit with them in that moment and not have the answers either. Obviously, this is pretty scripted because we wrote it out. You might not sound exactly like this when you're talking to someone, but here, instead of reacting, which, yeah, if you click, it'll show the opposite version of this. Yeah, this is something we sometimes see, maybe not exactly in this way, maybe paraphrase a little bit differently. And this is obviously a little bit extreme, but like, I don't know why the client is worried. I told them about this yesterday. You shouldn't worry either. We're working on it. It's a difference, right? A pretty big difference. And this could still be true. It could still be true that you told the client yesterday when the employment authorization card was coming, and you might be feeling frustrated because you're like, I already went over this. Those things can be true, but we can also rephrase this, right? It's if the volunteer is coming to you and they're very concerned and they're stressed, affirming that, and then saying, just so you know, I also informed the client about this yesterday. This is when you're going to hear about this again. Typically, volunteers like to know when's the next time they're going to hear about something. And also some of it is that they don't know what to say to the client. They feel helpless in that moment. They feel like they don't have the information, and you might. And so it might seem like, oh, this isn't a big issue. But for them, it could feel very uncomfortable to be in a situation where they're not able to explain to the client what's really going on. And this is very disarming, right? This kind of active listening kind of prompts someone to go, yeah, it was difficult. Well, like, what's going on with this? And then asking you for the information, and then you can clarify from there. If someone hears this, they kind of feel this pushback, right? I don't know why the client's worried. And the volunteer can easily come back, well, I know why, they might not be able to get a job. And we can easily see how that could spiral a bit. And it's not as affirming, it's a little bit more deflective, right? So regardless of how true it is, it's a little bit more deflective and defensive. And again, if you have any questions or thoughts to share about times where you've gone through this, feel free. And I'm also happy for people to just interject and say, I've tried this and it's not realistic, or I've tried it and it's really worked. I'm happy. I think it's really great when people share experiences, and we might not get through every single scenario today, but happy to hear from all of you as well. Go to the next slide. So this is something I mentioned, providing concrete dates that a volunteer can expect to hear back on the status of something and what you're working on completing for the case. So especially with co-sponsors, support teams, there's so many moving aspects going on, and it can be difficult for an entire team to be aware of each step. So just something as simple as, I'm going to research this tomorrow and provide an update at our next team check-in. This kind of avoids the volunteer constantly reaching out to you via email, phone call, however they normally reach out to you, and not panicking. It also gives them a time frame to give to the refugee that they're working with, right? If the refugee is asking them a lot of questions, maybe you're not aware that maybe the refugee is asking them a lot of questions and they feel like they don't have an answer for them. A lot of times that's part of it too. And this also requires some vulnerability, right? So we talked about active listening, not reacting, having very direct communication of when you're going to look something up, when you're going to provide an update. But it's also vulnerability, right? Especially if we don't have the answer to something, we don't expect all staff members to be experts on every single aspect of the resettlement process, right? And there's going to be times where it's out of your control. And volunteers might look at you as the person who's in charge of everything, right? Especially if you're a caseworker or maybe a volunteer coordinator, they see you as the head of it all. And they may not be aware of all the different moving stakeholders that are involved in this, especially with things like benefits. We've seen that happen where volunteers get frustrated if benefits are delayed and kind of take that out sometimes on staff members. But it really, again, is disarming when we say, I actually don't have the answer to this. Let me get back to you. Or if you've made a mistake, again, that's like perfectly normal in every job. People make mistakes. If you forgot something, if you said you were going to follow up and you didn't, just saying, you know what, I forgot. Let me get back to you. Again, I'm sorry. When you also feel worried about a situation, that's also disarming, saying like, I'm also concerned, that's validating them, that it's not just them. Like, I'm concerned that we don't have the benefits either. I think it should be moving faster. I feel like XYZ about it as well. And also just admitting that the resettlement process is not as smooth as it could be. We all know that 90 days is like not enough for a refugee to feel self-sufficient. There's, again, so many moving pieces. I think just admitting that it's a bumpy process and it's not going to go exactly as a check mark box for each core service is really helpful for volunteers. And it kind of helps them relate to you as well, and not make you like an authority figure who's like, well, this needs to happen at exactly these days and these times. Like, just admitting that it's sometimes a messy process, and eventually everyone does get the services that they need, but sometimes it doesn't happen exactly when they might expect it to. Okay, you can click through. So again, if you know what TLDR means, just too long, didn't read. So if that's a lot to remember. So, specifically when things like a volunteer complains about something we know is normal, this is a very typical situation, just validating and normalizing that emotion. It is really hard that we have to wait for this. It's a normal part of resettlement that you're coming across, and just validating that for them. And there's one more. And just letting them know that you're there and ready to problem solve. And you can always ask, can I share my perspective on this, right? Maybe that also, again, disarming, allows them to feel like they're part of a conversation, that you're helping them problem solve, and you're giving options here. Anytime you can give options about when and how to talk about something, the easier it'll be to work with volunteers. Okay. So this is the part that we often see that there is some worry, right? With volunteers, with co-sponsor support teams, sometimes we worry that they might overstep a lot of the time. And like we mentioned earlier, like having a normal level of social capital is totally fine. You might have your own policies on what is typical for a co-sponsor support team or a volunteer group or individual provides. So obviously stick to that, but everyone is trying to work towards refugees getting to self-sufficiency. So that's something we encourage in volunteers as well. So something to think about is, why do volunteers volunteer, right? And the most common scenarios we think of are not do not revolve around encouraging individuals to be self-sufficient. A lot of volunteer experiences are about directly helping, directly giving, providing a donation. It's very direct and it's very giving oriented. It's in the name, right? There's not many volunteer experiences beyond this that many people can think of that really revolve around teaching an adult how to become self-sufficient. It's hard to think of other volunteer scenarios besides co-sponsorship where there's this task of helping an adult get used to the United States and being with them for like a long process of that. It's a very unique volunteer experience. So if we can access some empathy that this is a skill, becoming a co-sponsor or support team, or even just a very dedicated mentor volunteer, it's its own skill set and we want them to stay. It's very unique. We want them to repeat the experience. So having empathy for that it's not the most typical volunteer experience either. So some of the things you can do, especially to like, if you're going to start setting boundaries and having some of these like tougher conversations with volunteers, you want to make sure there's a foundation of trust first and that you have a relationship with them, right? Something you can do to do that and kind of preempt people or get them prepared for things is explaining common scenarios to expect throughout the RMP period. If you have seen that clients get really frustrated at a certain time or with a certain service, tell the volunteers that. It's not going to scare them away. They're here, they went through the training. Let them know about common things that happen so that they can be more prepared, right? Things like, sometimes when the refugees come in, maybe like to their home for the first time, they feel overwhelmed. They might not ask a lot of questions. Here are some things you can do to kind of like, get them used to like using appliances, etc. Show a lot of interest in the work being done and appreciation. I know we often have ways to kind of complement the things that volunteers are doing, whether it's through newsletters, you might have your own standardized practices. But when you have more one-on-one relationships and you're like, wow, that's really amazing, and sharing the excitement, even though you're busy, even though there's a lot of moving things going on, just taking the time to show that appreciation and saying that is a really big help. There are some clients who don't get that level of assistance, and this really matters more than maybe, you're even aware of. So thank you for that. And ambiguity is probably the most frustrating thing for volunteers in this process, not knowing when something's going to happen or when something's going to be delayed. So just, share any delays you foresee happening and just being as straightforward and proactive as possible. And that helps really build that relationship. Okay. And boundary setting is hard, right? There's different levels of boundary setting. Some are between volunteers and clients, some are between you and the volunteer, but we want to avoid client dependency, obviously, on volunteers. You might have your own offboarding processes that you've thought of, worksheets, ways to prepare volunteers and clients for offboarding. If you don't have those resources, definitely consider thinking about it or talking about it with your team. Like, how can we better prepare volunteers and clients both for the offboarding process? Because for both, it can be difficult in different ways. And a lot of that is also just redirecting the volunteer to check with the client on their goals rather than the volunteer create goals for the client. We see that a lot. I'm sure many of you see that a lot. And in check-ins being like, what does the client want in this scenario? I'm just curious. Did they tell you this? Or if you hear them talking about goals that you haven't heard of before, just asking open-ended questions like we talked about with the active listening. When did that come up? Are they interested in this? Do they need help with this, etc. Right? Like asking those probing questions to kind of really understand where something came from before making an assumption. Okay. And these are some examples of questions to ask to maintain the boundaries. So how comfortable does the client feel utilizing public transportation? That's a question you can ask if that's something you're concerned about. For example, if you see that the volunteers are driving the clients everywhere, but you'd like them, if you'd like the client to start learning how to use this, instead of kind of saying something like, well, they really need to learn how to use public transportation, you should stop driving them. That might kind of be a bit more reactive. The volunteer might feel bad, right? They might feel ashamed or kind of like guilty in some way, right? It might cause like a defensive reaction. So just asking, right? I'm just wondering, how's public transportation going? They might say, they're not, we haven't really been doing that. They're not that comfortable. Then asking, oh, okay, well, what's the plan? Is there anything, any resources I can provide so that you all feel comfortable helping the client use public transportation? Is there anything preventing the client from wanting to learn how to use public transportation? And the volunteer then might naturally be like, you know what, we've been driving them around a lot. That's really been the case. Should we start doing this? And then it invites them to problem solve with you. And you can ask them, what are some goals the client is excited about or feels urgent about, so that again, it's refocused on the client, just asking questions about the client and allowing the volunteer to share their observations, rather than kind of letting the volunteer like take over the conversation and share everything that they think should be going on, because we see that happen too. So here's a very specific scenario, right? You meet with your volunteer for a check-in, and one of the volunteers begins to say, I was over the house a few days ago to help Freya study for her driver's license exam. The children kept interrupting and jumping all over her and acting crazy. I stopped teaching the lesson and gave her advice on how to better parent her children. I told her she can't let her children act like that. I also noticed at lunch that she served them a lot of high in sodium food and sugary juice, and I told her I was concerned that might be why they're acting hyper. I don't know if any of you have been in a scenario like this, where you've heard kind of like maybe some unsolicited comments about a client's lifestyle, their choices in food, their choices in parenting. This is where we start to see this is like an overstep. Yeah, Zoe saying she's absolutely heard that exact comment multiple times. I'm just curious, yeah, in the group, if people can unmute, right, Joy? Yeah. How did people deal with this in the past, or have you heard this kind of thing before, and what was the result?
I can definitely speak for a volunteer group that I was working with where the child actually had significant like health issues and was constantly seeing a doctor for like unrelated things. And so when she brought this up to me, my reminder to her was, the child's health is kind of between the parents and the doctors. If there's something that the doctor is concerned about, the doctor will be sure to share that with the parent. I know the parents are very concerned about the health of their young child. That's not our responsibility. We're not involved in those decisions. So we should not be focusing on those things. I don't think she really listened, but I did my best at least to try to communicate that multiple times.
That's great redirection. Thanks for sharing. That's great redirection to say we should keep that with the doctor, right? Whoever the professional is in that situation.
This leads me to a question, because if we're working with clients or the volunteer is working with clients who are not from the US and don't know all of the opportunities. So let's take, just for example, the doctor situation, and we can talk about behavior too, but maybe they're unaware that there are specialists or second opinions. Maybe they're unaware that there are IEPs and 504s available at school and things like that. Can you let the volunteer know? Is that a part of cultural orientation that the volunteer can incorporate in talking about, or is that just completely off limits for the volunteer and we need to think about it on our end and how to support the client in that situation?
I think I heard it was a little hard to hear. I think I heard like, is it appropriate for volunteers to be educating clients on how to reach out to specialists and professional, and like how to educate them that's available? Is that what you're asking, if that's appropriate?
Yes. Yeah, just how to let yeah, basically how to.
Yeah, I think that's totally appropriate. So that's another, like, volunteers can absolutely educate on different ways that clients can then access resources. There's nothing to say that that can't be done. Now it's up to each local, national agency to decide what they would like volunteers to be discussing, and that's where you defer to whoever the volunteer coordinator is, community sponsorship coordinator is, and thinking through like, is that something volunteers will feel comfortable talking through? Like, those are things I would think about, not so much, is it appropriate, but is it something that volunteers feel comfortable doing? Is it something that you want volunteers to be talking about with clients? And I think it's a great way for volunteers to kind of stop putting their own personal thoughts, because we all do, right? I do. Everyone does. If a refugee came to me and asked me, I might have my own personal opinion. But if I'm following the guidelines of the agency and the things I know that are people who are specialists in it, we want to make sure the client is going to someone who they can talk about these things, whatever that looks like. So yeah, I think that's totally appropriate. Yeah, for volunteers to be educating on the different resources. Yeah. Good question. That's really, again, that's a question of like, what as an agency are you all comfortable with, like allowing volunteers to kind of go into with clients?
Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to share about if they've been through a similar situation, how they handled it? And maybe you can put in the chat, like, how do you typically feel in this sort of situation? I think it's important to be honest with ourselves and like check in when we kind of hear that. What is our first reaction? Are we annoyed? Are we frustrated? Are we alarmed? Like, what's going on for us so that we're not maybe just reacting like, oh, you shouldn't say that, right? You know, and maybe there's some shame feeling there, even if what they said was like totally like, we don't want them to tell, you know, clients how to parent their children, but thinking about a sensitive way to talk about it, right? And then checking in with yourself about how you're feeling is important. You can go to the, next slide. Okay. So we might want to ask, you know, we're never going to have this much time in an actual scenario or in a check-in to like really stop. How am I feeling, right? And then all this, but in the moment for now, you can kind of think about it like this. We can check in with how we're feeling and then what's happening, right? What's happening with the volunteer? Is it that they like to be controlling and have a lot of thoughts and want to do that? Like, right? Like, what are we thinking about them? But what could really be happening is that the volunteer wants the client to be able to focus on the instruction, right? That's amongst all of the other like really like, right? The comments about the food, the comments about this and that. What is really the issue? The issue is that the volunteer feels frustrated they can't complete their task, right? Which is not helping them, you know, not allowing them to, you know, complete this driver's license orientation. Maybe her cultural norms about parenting and child rearing are clashing with the client's cultural norms. Again, this is a very unique volunteer experience. They're interacting with someone from a totally different background, typically. And maybe there's a language barrier. There's a lot of things that are like breeding grounds for miscommunication. So this is normal. I just, you know, we need to think about that this is a normal thing that people might bump up against, that they're seeing something that they're not used to seeing. And she might think that she's right? Like, hey, you should stand up for yourself and here's some advice, right? Some people, maybe they would like to receive advice in that way. So we should be thinking about really the intent of some of these comments. Like maybe it's making us frustrated because we don't want them to make clients feel uncomfortable or whatever it is, right? But just thinking about where they're coming from too. And yeah, this exactly goes to the culture. Someone put in the chat, the cultural competency part is really important, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Preparing volunteers for these different interactions. If you know that clients from a specific place of origin, you know, have different types of food requests or different types of, you know, maybe they don't like using mattresses, they prefer like a mat, whatever it is, right? Keeping them informed so that they are aware and not as surprised when certain things happen. Yeah, really good point. Okay, we'll go to the. Okay, so now we've kind of prepped ourselves, thinking through and kind of having some compassion of maybe where is this person coming from? You can click through these. These are just some ways you can respond. Right. And again, it's fine if you don't do all of these. You're never going to communicate as perfectly as a PowerPoint, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to just keep in mind some of these bolded portions, right? Validating and normalize like what they're going through. I totally get wanting to ensure that Freya is able to focus on her driver's license exam and study without interruption. That makes sense. Notice how you're not validating anything else. You're validating the goal of trying to get Freya to be able to complete the volunteer task, right? So you don't have to agree with any of that, right? And you can just validate, like, yeah, it makes sense that you want her to be able to pay attention. Providing some sort of solution. You know, I think we should just make sure there's another volunteer present there to babysit the children while you're working with Freya on this task. And then, yeah, helping them remember some of their prior training. Remember when we talked about cultural norms, this is that cultural competency and humility portion Marissa mentioned. This is one of those moments where we need to be sensitive about the family's choices around parenting, childbearing, and nutrition. Maybe what you grew up with is not what they grew up with. This is what they can afford, et cetera, right? So we're not jumping into like, why would you say that? That's really inappropriate, right? And you know your volunteers best. You know who responds well to certain things. So if you have like a different relationship with a volunteer, you can adjust. If you know some volunteers like need a more direct response, that's fine. These are just things to kind of help you have a framework. So yeah. All right. Go to the next slide. And here's just some other ways you can respond, right? Show the client's perspective. I know you may not see this dynamic this way. You hold a lot of power being a volunteer who helps with a lot of tasks and helps them get around. She may not express she feels uncomfortable with the statements you're making, but let's try and consider that, right? And saying it as sensitively as possible. You've already offered some problem solving with them. And show belief in the volunteer's best attempt. I think this actually might be the most important aspect, right? When we're asking for course correction or boundaries to be set, it's really important that the volunteer doesn't feel shame, right? Think about when you've made an error without realizing it, or there's something someone has asked you like, hey, you know, and this happens in all of our relationships that people might say like, I need this expressed in a different way. And you want people to assume the best intent for you, right? We also want volunteers to assume best intent of the agency, right? Think about it in the reverse. We're like, why can't they just like believe that we're doing our hardest, we're trying our very best to make these things happen, and that it's out of our control sometimes. Let's extend the same belief in the volunteer's intention. Like, I know you've done a lot for this family, and your intention would never be to intentionally make this family uncomfortable. I would assume like 99% of volunteers, that is the case, right? There's a lot of assumption that maybe they're helping and then maybe not, right? And then just asking, right? You know, you can be direct here. You know, let's refrain from making comments to the client specifically about like nutritional habits and things. Like, you've already said it, that's fine. If she chooses to, you know, stop serving juice, that's up to her. But like, that's something that's a personal choice for her. You know, our staff, you know, is here to refer them to the proper professionals if we notice Freya needs support. Like someone else mentioned, like can volunteers provide support in contacting the right references or the right specialists, and that's appropriate too. Okay. Next one. Yeah, so we went through that, and I'm just curious if anyone has a boundary scenario they'd like to kind of go through here, whether it's something in the past they've gone through or something they anticipate could happen. And it could be something you're dealing with right now or something that's happened already. I know it's a big group, so maybe feeling a little shy. Well, I'm gonna move on. If you have any that you'd like to put in the chat, feel free. I know it really benefits people to hear that their struggles with boundaries are not just on them. And I hope that some of the scenarios you all bring up like are things you can relate to and kind of jump off one another and kind of provide feedback. So again, this is the too long didn't read version, right? If they're struggling to allow a client to be self-sufficient, just in doubt, validate and acknowledge that what they're doing is overall helpful, but let's redirect as possible. So again, assuming best intent, acknowledge that what they're going through might be difficult in the moment, and then providing some options to move forward. And again, that's after we've established trust, there's been relationship building. So making sure that the connection at the beginning, before there's all these miscommunications, is good, that it's solid, right? They've seen your face in training, they've come to you for resources. So starting off with low stakes kind of things where they've been able to rely on you for consistent communication, and then you can kind of move into like, hey, let's course correct on a boundary, so it doesn't feel as severe. Someone put, we have a team who won't let go of public benefits, and we've let them know that we prefer this as hands off and staff will handle directly. We have tried redirecting them with other goals, tasks, but it continues to be a challenge after multiple conversations with staff. This is a big one. I think benefits is actually the most difficult thing for volunteers to kind of let go of. I have a volunteer who has paid for some of our clients' bills. We appreciate the volunteer's generosity. I'm concerned there might be some control issues or manipulation going on. It's hard to know. Now, I'm going to take a step back from responding to I don't know if anyone else has seen these things or if they've found ways to respond to these scenarios.
So I can say in our experience, some of it has been good intention from the volunteers. And it's ultimately harmful to the client, but the problem that they are facing is that the client is coming to them and asking for money and saying, you know, our case manager isn't doing anything, nobody's doing anything, nobody's helping us. And what they're doing is just using survival skills. It's a fear-based thing. It's not, you can't really blame the client for using those skills in that situation where they're scared about, you know, what they're going to do for their family. But the volunteers hear that and they go, oh my gosh, like I need to do something about this. And so they do it. And then they tell us after. I mean, that hasn't happened recently, but we've had it in the past. And we have to explain, you know, if they ever ask you for money, tell us first. Tell us first. We'll figure out what's going on. We're doing a lot of support around, you know, financial support. The case manager is responsible for making sure that they're receiving financial support. The way that our group is structured, though, you know, our volunteers are not providing any financial support. So that kind of creates a clear division where we can say, if this ever comes up, you guys aren't supposed to handle this.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to tell volunteers, even if they are responsible for some level of financial support, that if a client is asking for this, check in before you do anything about it, because it might be something that's really fine. But it might be something else. And like, we can discuss what the options are and we can kind of game plan. So volunteers don't feel like they're in a situation where they're being begged for money and,
Yes.
don't want to refuse if it's really going to harm somebody. But ultimately, also there are situations where volunteers kind of feel like can also approach a situation where they are crossing a boundary because they feel very responsible, or they want to, I don't know if I would use the term control for the ones that I've seen, but I think they can sometimes have that mindset of like, we're adopting this family, you know, we're responsible. And it's like, no, the family is actually responsible for themselves. You know, we're providing support that's different. So I think it's important to kind of investigate where that's coming from too, and get to the bottom of those kind of things as well.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about clients, right? That a lot of, maybe it's not even volunteer like driven, it's client driven, and then they feel this need to react. So making sure you all are including that in training, and yeah, like that's a perfect example of just like, hey, check in with us before you make a decision on any of those things, and giving them something to say, right? You know, to the client, right? Hey, I have to actually check with the caseworker on this, or let me get back to you. So that they don't feel this pressure to immediately resolve things. Yeah. I'm trying to see if there's anything else in the chat. All right. I know we only have 15 minutes left, so I'm just going to move very quickly through these. So these are boundary settings between co-sponsors and you, right? Not just between the volunteers and clients, but like volunteers and co-sponsors, support teams, and staff. Making sure that there's a process, especially if you have staff that are new to working with volunteers, making sure they're prepped for that. Making sure that updates are discussed only at specific meeting times to avoid too much back and forth and things get lost that way as well. And that you have that you and the rest of your colleagues have a way to discuss if there's issues. Some of the issues you all are bringing up now, is there a mechanism for when things go too far, right? Like we've brought this up with a volunteer once or twice. What's the next step, right? When a lot of you already know how to use some of the skills I'm talking about, like active listening, redirecting, and best case scenario, they take to that very well and they change the behavior. If they don't, for example, they keep paying for something that you said, hey, we don't want you to do that, or, they keep interfering with the benefits. How are you going to all come as a team to decide what needs to happen next, right? Shouldn't be like just like one person making a decision unless, the team is okay with that. And maybe it is, maybe they say, you know what, at this point, then we go to our volunteer services manager and say, hey, we bring them in and see if that changes anything. Bringing in someone who's maybe the volunteer is not used to hearing from, and maybe that signals to the volunteer that this is something serious, right? If that's not enough, what do we do there? Having those conversations is important. And I don't see that often, that there's like a hierarchy of what are we going to do when it gets to this point, right? And so some of you, when you're bringing up boundaries, like we've already tried a lot of these things. How as a staff, as a team, are you going to come together to resolve this? Because you don't want to also burn bridges, right? A lot of you want to be able to redirect the behavior and not have volunteers upset, not have community members upset. But you also want to maintain your boundaries. So just examples of statements, like if someone's calling you unprompted and really venting, you can acknowledge how frustrating the situation is and say, I want to give it my full time. Let's talk about this at our meeting. So ways you can protect your time throughout your day. Just another scenario of like a volunteer calls you for the second time about the status of like an employment authorization card. They seem flustered and are using similar wording to what you've heard the client say to you. So now you know that they're hearing this from the client, kind of parroting it back at you. And you're frustrated because now you feel you're taking more time to explain something that is just delayed while you need to complete other things. This is a common scenario, that like, again, clients might come to the volunteers very stressed and asking about something over and over again. You can go to yeah. So again, similar to what we did about like, why is the volunteer having these thoughts about, why, like what Freya should be for food and snacks, right? And drinks and things like that. Thinking about it in the same way, why is the volunteer calling you outside of meeting times with a sense of like urgency, right? Thinking about different worries they might be having, like I need to help this client, I'm responsible for their well-being, and so they might feel that pressure on themselves. They feel like they can't remember if they discuss this in training, they're worried about missing something important, and they also just might be frustrated for the client, right? Like, oh, they can't work because of this, all of that. Go to the next slide. And what are ways you could respond to this volunteer, right? You can provide validation that it's a difficult process, that, that there's delays that are unfair and frustrating to everyone, including the client. Giving volunteers permission to not have to answer the client right away. And yeah, I'm not going to read through all of these, but there's ways you can this sort of template for them to use to talk to clients so that they don't feel frustrated with you or with the system as much. You can go to the next slide. Okay. We're at the last bit of this, right? If there's other scenarios you've encountered between you and volunteers, again, happy to hear them in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and share them, we can stop and listen and brainstorm together. You can go to the next slide. And so as you're thinking of those things, if you want to talk about them, just keeping in mind expectations of volunteers, right? It's really hard to assume like volunteers will understand and integrate concepts about government document delays that they've never encountered before. Some of you said this is the first time they're confronting poverty, and they are not aware of all the different services, all the different kind of guidelines that kind of surround some of these things and these systems that the clients are a part of. They might not understand the concept of self-sufficiency fully, boundaries, trauma-informed care, and we really only have time sometimes to provide 3 to 5 hours of training prior to meeting a client. And typically that training is based on like, where are they going to go pick them up from the airport? Like you have to get all those logistical things down. So they're really focused on that aspect. And while many of them enjoy the aspect of training that talks about boundaries and trauma-informed care because it's new to them and it's more soft skill oriented, they're really focused on getting the job done well for you. And that's usually the more logistical pieces. So they might need to be reminded about these things over and over again. Yeah, okay. So we kind of already talked about this. You really need to discuss as a team, like, how are we going to resolve some of these if a volunteer is not picking up what we're suggesting? And you want to make sure you're documenting some of this on a written format. I really suggest, you know, like writing down, if you're the caseworker, if you're the volunteer coordinator, each time you have a conversation, keep track of it. Discussed this concern, right? Keep your own log. And then you have something to kind of share, right? With your manager, with leadership, like, hey, this is something that we've been doing a lot of. This is how they've been responding, even if it's just like a short 2 sentences, right? So we can get a picture of what's going on. There should be like some format of, you know, what will happen if, like, what are your definite like boundaries of like, if this happens, we have a big issue, right? Like it could be volunteers showing up unannounced and taking clients away when they have an appointment, things like that, things that interfere with their service provision. That's pretty serious. Maybe that looks a little different than just redirecting them. Maybe that's a different kind of conversation that you have with a volunteer. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that this is all very challenging. You're working with a variety of personalities. Volunteers are all different, have all different experiences, have all different thought processes. And you're kind of switching from doing those, especially if you're a caseworker, you're going from doing the activities to directing them. And it's really challenging to kind of listen sometimes to maybe what the volunteers are saying to you. Maybe you wouldn't respond that way. And maybe you feel like you're having less of a personal connection because the volunteers are more involved, whatever it is. Those are really challenging. But at the same time, and we can go to that next slide. It's rewarding to also see that the community really cares about refugee issues. Your clients are forming real and personal connections and getting that social capital that we were talking about they wouldn't have had otherwise if they didn't have the community involved. They're getting employment opportunities, often different sort of housing opportunities because volunteers are helping find that. So it's both, right? It's challenging and rewarding. It's never going to be either or. It's never going to be all bad or all good. It's a very complex process, getting people understanding all the different sides of resettlement, right? All the different challenges, all the different aspects of it. Yeah. So there's only one more slide. And again, both those challenges and the rewards kind of help with debunking myths and stereotypes of refugees and increasing advocacy overall. So you're doing important work by engaging the community and kind of having these boundaries, but I just want to leave I know we have 5 minutes. If there's anything you all want to share about boundaries, and I'm happy to share my email. I know there's lots of people on this call who probably want to collaborate and talk more about different things we can do to help each other with maintaining boundaries that feel fair for everyone, and that it's an ongoing conversation. Like 1 hour isn't enough to kind of go over every single boundary scenario, but hopefully this kind of gets you all thinking about different ways you can start maintaining boundaries. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Emily, for such a great presentation, and also a reminder at Refugee Welcome Collective will also provide technical assistance, so also feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And I just want to mention this before we leave, because this is such an exciting news for us. I want to talk about our state-by-state resource map. You may have seen it on our website. State-by-state resource map is a map that we created as RWC, and we created it to make it easier for newcomers, for community sponsors, resettlement agency staff like yourself, and sponsorship staff to find and share local resources and services for employment, education, childcare, food, and cash assistance, and beyond. So we have had a map for a while now. We have worked with state refugee coordinators and state refugee health coordinators to populate the resources for the statewide resources. And now the exciting thing is we're working with you at the local level to actually populate the resources locally where you work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So how do you get to the map? You can go to our website, refugeewelcome.org. If you go to state-by-state resources, or you can scan this QR code right now, and that would direct you straight to the map. Now let's look into how can you be part of that. You can, if we can go to the next slide, you can actually add services. So you will find on every page within each state, you will find a button to submit a new service connection. Once you click on it, you will be directed to an online form to fill out. So you will just follow these steps and you can populate these resources. We all have been there. We have been in places where we needed these resources and we were wishing there was some place where I can find this resource. So this is an opportunity for you to provide that to someone to access this information. And also you can edit some services. So if we can go to the next slide. Sometimes you might find a service that you're like, you know what, this information needs to be updated. I tried to call this place and it wasn't the right number, and I found that this is the right number. So please feel free to also submit some edit to a service that you might find around you. We really need your help in that. So there are 4 ways that you can participate. If we can go to the next slide. You can introduce the map to your colleagues. Again, refugeewelcome.org, and just go to state-by-state resource map. And also you can use the map in your daily work. We have been having a lot of staff that have been using the map so far, a lot of private sponsor groups, community sponsorship. Also, please update the map, add the resources and the services, and encourage your colleagues who are working with you if they stumble at any resource that would be helpful, and the community members that you're working with, the volunteers who are hands-on, the community sponsors who are hands-on, the private sponsor groups that you might come across, to just add these services. So these are the 4 ways that you can participate, and we look forward to your participation. And with that, we're going to end with our time for feedback. So if you have any feedback on today's webinar, we would love to hear from you, and also any suggestions for future webinars, so we can continue building on our webinars in that way. So thank you so much. If you can take a minute to scan this QR code to submit your feedback, that would be great. And it's been great seeing you all. Thank you.